We are halfway through this legendary journey through Hyrule's history, and what a ride this Zelda series has been. The first game was new, smart, and exciting, with terrifically balanced gameplay and a large open world to lose yourself in. A Link to the Past refined and expanded the formula, introducing the parallel worlds concept and a new emphasis on plot and world building. Ocarina of Time blew open the scope of Hyrule with a more intricate and expansive epic unfolding over a much longer quest. Majora's Mask, Link's Awakening, Oracle of Ages, and Oracle of Seasons upheld the high standard of quality while offering fresh and unique mechanics, puzzles, and stories. And Wind Waker, despite a handful of problems, still shone as a beacon of charm and creativity. So the question becomes, how long can the Zelda series sustain this unprecedented level of consistency? I've never hesitated in calling the era between A Link to the Past and Wind Waker the golden age of Zelda. It therefore stands to reason that the first game released after the end of this period should mark a noticeable decline in quality. Four Swords Adventures was released for the GameCube as a sort of quasi-remake of Four Swords, turning a quick and innocuous side project into a large and fully realized level-based game. Four Swords Adventures is, to me, an overly long and mostly boring title that offers very little of what I love about the Zelda series. The music and art style are recycled, the puzzles are uninspired, the plot and villain are forgettable, and the items are turned into temporary power-ups, which to me contradicts the spirit of the series and its pacing. It's also extremely expensive and impossible to play nowadays, having never been re-released on any console and requiring a bunch of obscure tech that even back in 2004 nobody had. I know a lot of people love this game, but to me, Four Swords Adventures is one of the worst Zeldas. So, while I would love to just move on and forget about this multiplayer nonsense, it's not that easy because the next core Zelda game ended up seeing gameplay and story tie-ins with the Four Swords games. This title was called the Minish Cap, developed by Capcom, who of course did a terrific job with Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. In this game, Link is given the ability to shrink down to microscopic size and explore every nook and cranny of a much more dense and compact Hyrule. For me personally, the Minish Cap has always been a beloved classic. I remember it being the first Zelda game that I knew about before its release, and from the first moment I played it on a display at a department store, I was instantly hooked. But, unfortunately, I had to replay Minish Cap as an adult. And
how can I put this?
I love this game for its place in my childhood and for the moments of fuzzy nostalgia, but it doesn't hold up. It's pretty bad, it's dreadfully boring, and I just could not wait for it to end. It's painful to say, but if I'm being honest with myself, Minish Cap was the first time in the series that I felt completely and utterly disengaged. In order to explain why Minish Cap falls short as a Zelda title to me, I would like to recap and celebrate what has made the previous games so good. These components may differ from person to person, but for me, there are 6 key elements that are indicative of the best Zelda games: story, music, combat, items, pacing, and dungeons. Now, I'm not saying that every Zelda game needs to conform to the same pattern, or that they need to hit all of these out of the park with no wiggle room. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. There are genuinely great Zelda games that misstep on at least one of these. But for the sake of comparison, it's a decent enough blueprint for a title as formulaic as Minish Cap to be judged against. So to make things clear and organized, I'm going to just dive into each of these, using previous games as frames of references, and see how exactly Minish Cap stacks up. A great Zelda story resonates on 2 levels, one as a self-contained compelling plot, and again as an expansion of Hyrule's ever-unraveling lore. A Link to the Past stands out as a prime example of how a relatively simple plot can excel at both of these. The story is fast-paced and straightforward, and even in the second half when the narrative slows, we are still learning all sorts of backstory about Ganon and the sages that keep us intrigued and engaged in this wonderful mythos. And then we have the story of Four Swords Adventures, which is unprecedentedly bland and unremarkable. There's an evil sorcerer named Vaati who wants to declare war on peace and happiness or something. It doesn't matter, because it is as generic and uninspired as can possibly exist. The Minish Cap, unfortunately, is a continuation of this story, or rather a prequel showcasing the origin of Vaati. In this game, we learn that Vaati's motivation is that he was fascinated by the evil in the hearts of men. Obviously, this adds a tremendous level of depth to this fascinating character. Vaati was apprenticed to the wizard Eslo, who creates a hat that grants the desires of the wearer, which just invites a whole host of questions like, Why is this possible in a universe where the most highly sought after divine relic does exactly that? I mean, literal wars have been fought over this thing, and this man can just cook one up in a fucking lab? Ezlo accompanies Link throughout the game, and he is annoying as shit. He constantly interrupts and remarks on the most obvious of things like, "Hey, don't walk into lava, you fucking dumbass!" Ezlo and Vaati belong to the Minish tribe, a new race of tiny people that live in mushrooms and attics and library books. The Minish are very likable overall, and it's too bad they've never been so much as mentioned ever again. The Minish hold the secret to forging the weapon capable of defeating Vaati, the Four Sword, which can split Link into 4 copies. This weapon was the premise of Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, and I guess you could call Minish Cap a sort of way to experience those games in a single-player setting. I do question the need for this, however, since neither of those games are very good. Vaati basically fulfills the bare minimum requirements for a villain in this series. He's essentially the same villain as Varan, maybe slightly less interesting, running into Link a couple of times and eventually possessing the King of Hyrule. The difference is that when he shows up, he almost exclusively talks to Ezlo, and their relationship is laughably underdeveloped. Vaati, no, don't take the magic Triforce hat! But I hate you, Ezlo! You smell, and I hate you for all time! No, Vaati, don't do it!
I wish to be the most powerful sorcerer in the world!
He shows up at Hyrule Castle and turns Zelda into stone because reasons, and now Link must go seek out the Minish to save her. I guess because he just happens to be standing in the room at the time. Hey, why don't we send Link? Why not? He's right there. Alright, good work everyone. 3-hour lunch, 3-hour lunch, 3-hour lunch. Yeah! So Link must go and travel around Hyrule to gather the 4 Zelda artifacts of the day and put up with Ezlo's incessant bullshit to awaken the Four Sword, and there's really not much else. The finale features the exact plot twist from Ocarina of Time, where Vaati uses Link to open a door that he can't get through, and the game ends the same as A Link to the Past, with the Triforce hat being used to undo all the damage done. Nothing of consequence happens, and very little is contributed to the lore. I don't think the story is god-awful, but it doesn't make me feel anything, and I don't remember much of it after the fact. We've seen already in the Zelda series that a game can still be great despite a lackluster story. One of the best elements of Oracle of Seasons is its impeccable pacing. There's always somewhere new to go, something new to find, and something rewarding around every corner. It's a very hard game to put down, which is the most telling sign of good design. Minish Cap is the opposite in that it's a very hard game to pick up. It underwhelms in every sense of the word when it comes to pacing. The game is linear to a degree that is completely unprecedented for the series. It's almost comical how far into the game you have to progress before you can even make one decision on where to go next. You have to follow such a long, narrow path to open the game, they even block you from going back into town for some reason. Eventually the game progresses in standard fare for handheld Zelda, with each new area opening up as you complete each dungeon. This Hyrule is unbelievably small. There's only a handful of areas and each one is just a short walk in length. But this is largely compensated for in sheer density. There is a lot of secrets and collectibles crammed into each region. As a Minish, the world expands greatly, and some of the most enjoyable moments of the game come from exploring tiny cracks and crevices as a Minish. Completely exhausting an area of secrets contrasts nicely with the last game's sprawling ocean, and to an extent, there is a good amount of fun in just discovering one thing after another. But there are too many flaws in the pacing to ever allow this to develop. For one, the game is annoyingly random when it comes to opening up new events. Remember how in Ocarina, the Bombchu Bowling and the Mask Shop were not open right away? Now imagine that extended to every fucking thing. Early in the game in Hyrule Town, oh, this place is closed, this place is closed, this place is closed, this place is blocked off. And even worse, a terrible new mechanic called Kinstone Fusions invites in even more opportunities for this crap, because tons of characters don't want to fuse Kinstones until some specific point in the game. So you either have to go check on every person all the time, or you postpone everything until the end when every fusion is available. But that's not a good idea because there's actually a missable item that is only unlocked through a certain fusion before a certain time. Plus there's tons of upgrades and sword techniques that you definitely want as early as possible, so the only entertainable option is just to run around checking on everything all the time. Some people will suddenly want to fuse Kinstones after like 45 seconds since you last checked. It's fucking asinine. Even events that are necessary to progress are extremely restrictive and diminish the game's replay value a lot. Even if you know what to do, you have to go and activate the trigger that allows you to do it. These include talking to one specific Minish to get another Minish to move out of the way, talking to a specific Minish to get a Jabbernut to appear, talking to a specific Minish to open a library, and even wading into a swamp to make a shoemaker fall asleep. Are you kidding me? What is the point of these extreme restrictions? This is that ghost ship crap all over again. Is there something inherently wrong with letting a player do things on their own volition? The other flaw in the pacing is probably my single biggest problem with the game overall. And it's the same problem the series as a whole has been struggling with. The rewards for discovering secrets are utterly worthless. When I mentioned the upgrades and sword techniques that you want as soon as possible, here's the catch. They're not actual upgrades to make Link stronger. Link in this game was simply nerfed to the point where every upgrade is just getting him back to normal. Nearly all of the sword techniques are ones that Link just naturally knew in the past, like the spin attack, the pot breaker, the dash attack, the sword beam. He also takes forever to charge his spin attack, he sucks at shooting a bow, his bombs take a year to explode, and he takes forever to split with the foresword. So these are all things that by upgrading you're essentially just fixing. Compared to actual buffs to Link to make things more fun and rewarding, this system just feels cheap. The other collectibles are plentiful but mostly useless. Heart pieces are generally fine, but there are so many of them now that the satisfaction starts to wear off sooner, and too many of them are in such plain sight that when you discover something really secret, it's more disappointing when it just leads to another heart piece, knowing that you'll probably stumble across many more just naturally. More than once, I even walked into a room, saw the heart piece behind a block, and decided it was not worth the 15 seconds to push the block. But it feels just as unsatisfying to get any other collectible, because these all just kind of link back around to each other. When you fuse a kinstone, generally some random chest will appear somewhere or some cave opens up, inevitably leading to just more kinstones, or more heart pieces, or secret shells, which I'll get to, or rupees, which are just used to buy even more kinstones or more secret shells. Everything just circles around in a great loop that eventually you're left wondering, why am I doing all this? Rupees and secret shells cap at $9.99 each, but are so plentiful that I probably would have doubled those totals in my playthrough had I actually been spending them. Rupees, like I said, are only used to buy kinstones and shells, because what's the point of buying a larger quiver when the bow is garbage? So that makes our last hope for a decent collectible the secret shells. These are spent in a figurine lotto shop, which is not a bad idea. It confines the figurine hunt from the last game into a much smaller scale, but of course it fails in practice. At first glance, it's the same system as the trophy lottery in Melee, except whereas in that game you could just mash through and get trophies quickly, here you have to sit through text. And then pull a lever. And then wait for an egg to hatch. And then sit through more text. Just for a chance at a figurine that you might not have yet. And it gets even more fucked up. In Melee, as you added more coins, your probability for a new trophy went up proportionally, but not in this game. Instead, each shell only increases by 1, meaning the first shell can be worth 60%, but the next one is only worth 1. Who the fuck did that math? It doesn't take... This means that the only efficient way to collect trophies is by spending one at a time. Because would you rather spend 2 shells for one 65% chance or for 2 64% chances? Either way, fuck you. And what is the point of all this? Still nothing but completion's sake. So, unfortunately what this means for the pacing is that eventually I just stopped seeking out new things because I had no reason to. I've 100%ed this game in the past, but there's no way I'm doing that again, so what's the point in 75%ing it? It's not a new problem for Zelda, of course, but it's especially prominent in this game because the main quest is very straightforward, so without a big world to explore or meaningful secrets to uncover, it just unravels on itself and becomes tedious. The game is much smaller than Oracle of Seasons, but it's roughly the same length because of terrible slow pacing. There are once again only 6 dungeons, which of course is weak in comparison to the other handheld games, but it's also not compensated for in the lines of Majora's Mask. The stuff in between dungeons tends toward the bland side, lots of just back and forth fetch quests. You have to stop and wonder, at what point does exploring become busy work? Go collect 3 library books, go collect 3 kinstone pieces, go collect 5 kinstone pieces. Or else it's just maneuvering through rather simple and straightforward areas like Mount Krenel or Royal Valley. The Minish Woods is great, but a good game can't peak by the first dungeon. Unfortunately, that's entirely the case with Minish Cap. Music is often pivotal in Zelda games to establish tone and evoke emotion. I can practically pick any Zelda at random to exemplify this, but let's focus on Ocarina of Time. The score in this game brilliantly bolsters the presentation and complements the environments, eliciting feelings of adventure, curiosity, dizziness, claustrophobia, tranquility, restlessness. In Minish Cap, the music is competent. The different areas have appropriate themes, and there's a handful of enjoyable songs, but on the whole, the tracks aren't noticeably catchy or memorable. They don't often stimulate emotions, and rarely do they enter the forefront of my mind while playing. If I were asked to pick my top 50 Zelda songs, I think only one song from Minish Cap would make such a list, the game's lone standout in my opinion, Minish Woods. Some other tracks that I enjoy are Temple of Droplets, Minish Village, and Hyrule Town. The rest of the music just kind of repeats a lot and is largely forgettable. Again, it's a competent score, but a step backward in most respects. A good assortment of items can make or break a Zelda game, and is one of the reasons why something like Zelda 2 doesn't feel quite as rich and rewarding as other titles. When it comes to an exemplary assortment of items, look no further than Majora's Mask. This game features a lot of items that are available to you from the get-go, including Deku Nuts and Sticks, bombs and bomb chews, but as you progress, you are rewarded with a near constant stream of new items that add a ton of gameplay variety. Returning items like the fire and ice arrows are pushed to their creative limits, and an entire new screen of masks give Link a whole host of unique abilities, including transforming into 3 different species. I bring up the transformation masks because the main new feature in Minish Cap is the ability to shrink down like Ant-Man. The titular hat is not an item in the traditional sense that you equip it to an item slot, but it functions in the same way. Hop on top of a stump or a completely normal looking rock, and Ezlo will shrink you down and let you explore new areas. It's definitely not a terrible idea, albeit it's not actually a new one as it's pulled straight from Four Swords, but to make it into the central gameplay element, I think it needed to be elaborated on more. There are of course puzzles and dungeons that require you to shrink down for some purpose, but it's always made explicitly clear what you have to do. Instead of asking yourself, how would shrinking help me in this situation? It's just, I'm gonna shrink here because the game is telling me to. It doesn't feel like a way of exploring the world in a new way, it feels like a way of just navigating designated areas. The main thing I like about the shrinking ability is actually the aesthetic of the Minish environments. There are some really pretty scenes in this game. I love the creeks with the flowers and giant plant life. I love all the little Minish homes, and I adore the aesthetic of Minish Village. And I honestly enjoy a handful of the shrinking puzzles. My favorite is one where you have to fall down a pit while small to crawl through a hole on the floor below. This is one of the only puzzles that actually has you asking how being Minish would help you instead of just pointing you where to go. But usually it's just, here's a portal, shrink down now, and it'll be clear what to do afterward. Just like with Oracle of Seasons, what the game really needed was the ability to eventually shrink down at will instead of at designated portals. This would have completely opened up the game to some hopefully interesting design. But as it stands now, it's just one of the more underwhelming central features of a Zelda game. The next core item is the Four Sword, which overall is used pretty well. Some of the game's best puzzles involve choosing which tiles to split on to dodge obstacles or hit switches. Unfortunately, there's plenty of annoying parts with the 4 links as well, as one hit to any of the copies will cancel the whole thing. And splitting takes forever, that is until you get a Tiger Scroll that speeds it up, but of course this requires a specific Kinstone fusion that becomes available at a totally unknown point. As for the traditional items, I wouldn't hesitate to call Minish Cap's selection the worst since Zelda 2. The Gust Jar is used to inhale things like pots and enemies and then spit them back out. It's pretty fun and gets some neat uses in the opening dungeon, but it's slow and clunky and doesn't come close to living up to its potential as a puzzle item. At no point, for instance, are you asked to suck up an object and then spit it out at a switch, or suck up a bomb to create an explosive projectile or anything like that. The next new item is the Cane of Who Gives a Shit, which is probably the dumbest item in Zelda history. It's used to flip over objects, which accounts for approximately 0 interesting puzzles. Oh my god, this minecart is upside down. What the fuck do I do? The mole mitts are used to dig through dirt, but again, this doesn't lend any sort of opportunity for fun puzzles. It's just annoying to see dirt on the ground and having to equip the mole mitts for some busy work. Remote bombs, which were again first introduced in Four Swords, make their single-player debut in Minish Cap. This is a terrific improvement on bombs and one that in my opinion should have become a standard for bomb upgrades in future games, but unfortunately this was not the case. This is the only returning item that impresses because every other classic item seems to have been stripped of all their utility and variety. The bow takes 6 to 8 weeks to shoot for some reason, and the light arrows are an absolute joke. They take fucking forever to charge and don't even deal substantial damage. The boomerang returns and it's fine I guess, but only by process of elimination because it's the only viable combat item for most of the game. The magical boomerang returns from Oracle of Seasons, but with way less freedom of movement. The best it can do now is basically a semicircle compared to the zigzags you could make it do before. It's also optional and thus not used for a single puzzle. The Rock's Feather makes no appearance, but the Rock's Cape returns as a shell of its former self. Long gone are the tight controls of Oracle of Seasons. This thing is incredibly stiff, with a lot of landing lag and way less freedom to move while airborne. The Rock's Feather was a great item for movement and utility in many different situations, but the Rock's Cape is just for crossing gaps. And lastly, there's the Lantern. The Flame Lantern, which returns, I shit you not, as a late-game dungeon item. Need I remind you that this is the item you get on the first fucking screen of an actually good Zelda game? One big problem that arises with the lack of utility in these items is that you basically always need your sword out. Remember how in Link's Awakening and the Oracle games you could unequip your sword to use items in combination with each other? That is completely gone for this game because none of the items have any combat utility. When you look at a Zelda game with great combat, like the Wind Waker, it's not hard to see that the most important thing is variety. There are a lot of fun and viable options for taking down enemies, and Link has a lot of movement options available. In a 2D game, obviously Link doesn't have the same physical capabilities, but even looking at Oracle of Seasons again, Link is able to move and jump around fluidly, and there's a wide variety of items available to help. Minish Cap fails on both these counts and makes several long strides backwards with its combat. The absence of the Rock's Feather is really felt. I feel like jumping should have been a new standard for top-down Zelda when it was first introduced, but Minish Cap decides to backpedal and stiffen up the combat. With problems like the shield locking you into moving slowly facing one direction, the spin attack taking forever to charge, and the only viable combat item being the boomerang, fighting for much of the game just amounts to wildly swinging your sword away at everything. It's boring. With the hidden sword skills largely teaching moves that were previously just standard for Link, only 2 of them are worth a damn. The first is the roll attack, the only new move for Link in this game and the lone saving grace for the combat as far as I'm concerned. It's really a neat move and there's a secret quick release version. The timing is pretty tight, but it's pretty fun to spam on groups of enemies. The other is the Hurricane Spin, which for some reason has been renamed the Great Spin, but not to be confused with the Great Spin in Twilight Princess, which is something totally unrelated. Anyways, this trivializes combat, which in normal circumstances would be a bad thing, but since the combat in Minish Cap is so bad, it actually becomes a relief. The brief moments where you can split into 4 and great spin through a wave of enemies are among the highlights of the game. The enemies in Minish Cap are largely unremarkable and mostly just buzz around and annoy the shit out of you as much as possible. For the most part, I just try to avoid them as much as I can, which of course is not a good sign. Bosses are an absolute joke. I'm talking every single one. I literally don't like one boss in this game. Some are inoffensive but just boring, like the giant Choo-Choo, which completely wastes the whole purpose and potential of the Gust Jar and just has you mindlessly sucking at his feet. But the rest of the bosses, I actively despise. First of all, fuck right off with this giant floating hand bullshit. It was way overused by the last 14 times, and yet still it returns as a monument of lazy boss design. Then there's Giant Octorok, better known as Giant Test of My Patience, the George pair, which look nothing like George as I remember him, And then the final boss Vadi, the second phase of which is probably the least fun I've had with the Zelda boss since the fucking genie from Link's Awakening. Get off the goddamn bottom of the screen. I need to be below you. Where's my boy Rhubarb when I need him? The final phase of the boss brings to light another big problem with how Minish Cap handles its UI. The fight requires 2 items plus the sword, meaning more pausing and unpausing just like in Oracle of Ages. But this hardware has 2 additional buttons, so why on earth is this still happening? It's because for some inexplicable reason they decided to map R to roll. But even worse is that they wasted L as a dedicated Kinstone fusion button. A dedicated Kinstone fusion button! This could easily have been select. I would think a no-brainer button map would be B sword, select fuse Kinstones, A, L, and R items. But apparently no one at Capcom had the sense to bring this up. There's not a time I can remember in the game where I unequipped the sword and didn't need to re-equip it again seconds later. So in practice we have a game with 1 item slot, the same as a game released 14 years earlier, ignoring all the progress and improvements made by the subsequent games. I just don't fucking understand. Dungeons are one of the most important elements of a Zelda game to not screw up. Oracle of Ages has nothing to compensate for as the entire game is brilliant, but still the dungeons stand out as mastercrafts of level design. Central puzzle motifs, fun gimmicks, challenging brain teasers, and engrossing atmospheres were all accomplished on inferior hardware with comparatively laughable presentation. Now, with everything else in Minish Cap being so frustrating, boring, or otherwise bad, it's becoming difficult to look at each of these elements objectively. I have to ask myself, are these dungeons actually bad, or is it simply the fact that I overwhelmingly just want the game to be over? Whatever it may be, these dungeons are passable at best. Except for Deepwood Shrine. Probably due in part to the fact that it's expected of a first dungeon to not be the most creative and complex. But even still, it's a very enjoyable opening dungeon with a few fun puzzles like rotating a barrel from the inside to come out of a hole at a different angle. But the next dungeon, the Cave of Flames, has got to be one of the most boring dungeons in the series. It's incredibly simple and mundane and doesn't require much brain power to solve. It's one of those dungeons where as soon as you open the boss door, you've already forgotten the whole thing because it's that monotonous. Fortress of Winds is better with some decent puzzles, but still weak. There is this part where you can choose which locked door to go through, but one of them is a clear wrong choice and a huge time waste. I dislike the aesthetic of this dungeon. It's ugly and brown, and I don't enjoy being here. The Temple of Droplets has a far better atmosphere and nice music and a couple of strong puzzles here and there. But once again, it's another pitifully straightforward and forgettable dungeon. It's also terribly tedious, and most of the puzzles are a goddamn rehash. The next dungeon is Palace of Winds, which at first glance is a new environment for a Zelda dungeon, taking place high up in the sky. But this is until you realize it's pulled straight from Four Swords Adventures. And this dungeon is the longest and most annoying by far. Again, maybe I was just too far checked out by this point, but every room just seems intentionally designed to piss me off. I especially love the puzzle that can be effed up so bad it requires you to walk up and out of the room to reset it, the moving platform that is programmed to leave just as you approach it, and the tight timing of this platform ride to push this block with these skulls in the way that the copy links can't destroy. This is fun, right? I don't remember what fun feels like. The second half of the dungeon is marginally better and features probably the best puzzles to be found in the game. Not that this is saying anything, but the combat is annoying and the dungeon way overstays its welcome. The final dungeon is Dark Hyrule Castle, and if I was expecting a suddenly great dungeon to materialize after a string of mediocrity, then I was only fooling myself. This dungeon is just as simple and pitiful as the rest, with a string of repetitive Darknut fights and hardly any new puzzles. One is good, the one I mentioned earlier about falling down a hole while Minish, but the only other is one copied straight from Oracle of Ages. In fact, most of the puzzles in Minish Cap's dungeons are recycled, either from previous games or from earlier in itself. We have puzzles pulled straight out of A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, and most prominently, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. When you have a game that basically just copies and reuses so many elements from better games, at some point you have to wonder, what is this game's purpose? What does it do to distinguish itself and justify its existence? This thought leads me to my seventh and final element that defines a great Zelda game, one which is destined to be the leader of them all. Every Zelda game has its own sense of identity. This is potentially the most important aspect of a game, the one that sticks with you long after the adventure is done, that really makes you feel something different. The Zelda series does this very well. Every game so far has felt wonderfully original, and each with its own sense of worth. And there is no better a title to exemplify this spirit than Link's Awakening. It has a totally unique tone, charming, whimsical, and mysterious. None of these describe dungeons or items or pacing, but nevertheless, it is the defining aspect of the game and its legacy. When it comes to Minish Cap, the sad reality is I can't think of a defining attribute. It's a game that struggles to justify its existence beyond just tide you over between Nintendo's 3D games. But I don't believe for a second that being a 2D handheld side story is an adequate excuse for Minish Cap. No Zelda game yet has felt like it existed just to tide you over. All the other portable games by this point have demonstrated this and set a standard for 2D Zelda that Minish Cap fails spectacularly to live up to. So overall, I would pretty confidently declare the Minish Cap as my least favorite Zelda that I've covered so far. I will always love the memories and nostalgia I hold for the game, but I'm not gonna lie and pretend that I had any sort of fun with it. Of the 7 core elements of Zelda that I've discussed, I don't think Minish Cap exemplifies a single one of them. Its highlights are few and far between and not strong enough to hide the fact that finishing this game was essentially a chore. So, if you like this game, please let me know why. I'll be very interested to hear, and really, in the grand scheme of things, it's impressive that it took me, 9 episodes to get to a game I didn't like, so not much of a blemish on the series as a whole as far as I'm concerned. Thank you all for listening to my rant, and I will see you next time for a topic that is long overdue.